2,500 years ago, a man sat under a Bodhi tree, determined not to budge until he saw all there was to see. Upon arising, now enlightened, the Buddha spent the next 45 years teaching a new and revolutionary way of seeing the world. The essence of his teachings, called the Dharma, was articulated in the Four Noble Truths, where he taught the path to the end of all suffering. Central to these teachings was an important notion that the Dharma is not just about humans. Rather, it includes all of the beings who share the earth. During the course of this film, we'll explore what the Buddha taught us about animals and our relationship to them. Most people raised in the West were taught that animals are very different from people. The food culture centers around eating animals. It's everywhere, in advertising, in restaurants, in the supermarket. And few people think twice before eating a hamburger, or steak, or a piece of chicken. The entertainment industry showcases them in circuses, and zoos, and aquariums. And the medical and cosmetics industries experiment on them. Most of us care very deeply about our companion animals, such as dogs and cats, but we often fail to extend this same compassion to other animals. Imagine instead a culture where animals are not harmed. When people are introduced to the Dharma, one of the first things they're taught is the first precept: cause no harm. And they're taught that this principle of non-harm extends not just to humans, but to all beings.
Unlike in Western culture, where animals are kind of considered a separate, almost a separate form of life, and humans are considered very, very different, in Buddhism, we're all considered to be just a part of nature. And that we all have the same, we could say 5 aggregates. We're all made up of the same kinds of stuff. So there's not a hard and fast dividing line between humans on the one hand and the creatures on the other. That's why the first ethical precept in the Buddha's teachings is not to take the life of any living being. So I think that's the fundamental stance from the point of view of the Dharma.
As a Buddhist, when you take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, one of the principles that by taking refuge in Dhamma and Buddha is that not harming other beings, not causing harm to other beings. That is the number one key principles that you take by taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha.
When I'm asked what's the major factor of Buddhism, I will say ahimsa. And ahimsa means non-harming. And in what I've learned of Buddhism, the non-harming is of ourselves, of others, including animals, and of the environment. Those 3 things are the 3 things that I see, at least our tradition, try to deal with all the time. To live lightly on the land. And that would certainly include not taking the life of another, not stealing their life, and also what their bodies were made of.
So the teaching is really, not to do any harm. That's the first precept, not to kill, or sometimes it's translated as harm living beings. And it's partly to do with a sense of compassion for the animal, a sense of recognizing that animals suffer. There's also, you might say, a more transcendent view of it, that, according to the Dharma, we take rebirth. And it might be that some of the animals that we are killing were once human beings, or hopefully we're moving up the strata. So I think it's basically seeing his teaching as a whole and putting all animals within that process of liberation.
I'm lucky in a sense I've taken the precepts in all three traditions. I'm a joint monk now in the Tibetan tradition and the Soto Zen tradition, but in my early days I trained in a Theravada tradition and spent a short time as a Theravada monk. So I've taken the precepts in all three traditions. In the early tradition of Theravada, the first precept was translated to me as Panatipada Varamani Sikapadang Samadhyami. I undertake the rule of training to refrain from causing injury to living things. That's all living things. That's how it was taught to me. And that's how I teach people. All living things. So we refrain from harming them. That's the same in the Tibetan tradition, because in the Tibetan tradition, the Vinaya is based on the early Patimokkha tradition anyway, so the precepts are more or less the same. The difference comes in the Zen tradition, where the first precept just says, do not kill. And this means do not kill the Buddha. Do not kill the Buddha mind, if you like. Do not do anything that hampers the growth and movement and flow of the Buddha mind, the Buddha nature, the Dharmakaya. So obviously the eating of animals and the interfering with the animal kingdom, exploiting it, does affect that precept, does block that flow, does get in the way of the flow of the Buddha mind, of the Dharmakaya. So the first precept, not to cause any injury to any living thing, means any living thing.
You know, it's interesting to me because the suttas on one hand are very clear about non-harming. And when they talk about beings, it's all beings, it's sentient beings. Included in the first precept of non-harming is to not take life. So that seems fairly clear to me that the Buddha was intending us to include in our field of metta or loving kindness all kinds of beings, from the smallest to the largest, the two-legged, the four-legged, the many-legged. So that's really how I hold it, and certainly how I try to live my life. And I don't claim to be perfect. There are challenging situations about that. But the first precept of non-harming is really very dear to my heart, both as an attitude towards, you know, people that I meet, certainly, but as I said, to all beings, and really knowing, acknowledging that to each being, their life is precious.
To practice compassion, to practice loving friendliness, metta, to appreciate, to develop appreciative joy of life. We always say we abstain from killing, one of the 5 precepts. So this precept applies to everybody.
Buddhism has 2 main branches, Mahayana and Theravada. In both lineages, the Buddha talks about our relationship to animals and the fundamental question of the morality of eating them. In the Mahayana scriptures, the Buddha is unequivocal, addressing the subject in detail in the Lankavatara Sutra. For innumerable reasons, the Bodhisattva, whose nature is compassion, is not to eat any meat. Thus, Mahamati, whenever there is the evolution of living beings, let people cherish the thought of kinship with them, and thinking that all beings are to be loved as if they were an only child, let them refrain from eating meat. If, Mahamati, meat is not eaten by anybody for any reason, there will be no destroyer of life. Thus, Mahamati, meat eating I have not permitted to anyone. I do not permit, I will not permit.
There are many different quotes of the Parasist Buddha talking about different lives and not eating meat. One of the very strong statement that Buddha had is, I condemn meat eating in all means. I have never approved of meat eating. I will never approve of meat eating. And I do not approve of meat eating for my followers. For all sentient beings are equal to me, like my only son.
For bodhisattva vows, lay people can also take bodhisattva vows if they choose. Monastics have our monastic precepts that are different from lay people, or at least more elaborated than what the lay people take as the 5 precepts. But the bodhisattva vows, they can also take vows, and the bodhisattva precepts will prohibit meat eating, whether you're a lay person or a monastic. It's very explicit.
So Buddha's main teaching is be vegetarian. Main teaching is don't kill animal, don't kill human body, don't kill animals, don't lying, don't stealing, very nice, honest, compassion for other to take care, for how is I can do other to benefit. Only these things remember, he said.
The Buddha also addresses the subject of eating animal products in the Surangama Sutra. Bhikshus who do not wear silk, leather boots, furs, or down from this country, or consume milk, cream, or butter, can truly transcend this world. In the Theravadan scriptures, only a few passages address the subject of eating meat. In the Jivaka Sutta, the Buddha discusses a notion called the 3 purities, saying that monks are not allowed to eat meat unless they know the animal was not killed for them. Jivaka, I say that there are 3 instances in which meat should not be eaten: when it is seen, heard, or suspected that the living being has been slaughtered for oneself. I say that meat should not be eaten in these 3 instances. I say that there are 3 instances in which meat may be eaten: when it is not seen, not heard, and not suspected that the living being has been slaughtered for oneself.
So one of the monastic rules in Theravadan Buddhism is that monks are allowed to eat meat. And I think that was a very practical thing at the time of the Buddha, as I understand it, because of the simple concept, beggars can't be choosers. And we have these penniless, wandering vagabonds who need to sustain their bodies in order to carry on their Dharma practice. If they went from house to house and said, no, I have to have a special kind of food, no, don't give me that, it would have been much harder for the lay community to support them. So the Buddha said it was permissible for them to eat meat as long as they didn't know, hear, or suspect that the animal had been killed specifically for them. If they suspected that or knew that, then they weren't allowed to eat that meat. So I think what the Buddha was saying is that as agents, we shouldn't, where we have a choice, we shouldn't be involved in that chain of killing. Even though the bhikkhu had not done the killing and someone else had done that, it was still considered improper if it was killed with the bhikkhu in mind. In a modern consumer society, when we walk into the supermarket, one has to wonder, who have those animals been killed for? And as an average consumer, it often feels to me like they were killed with me in mind if I buy that meat. So an updated understanding of that could be in this modern consumer society. By buying meat and fish products, we're participating in that same chain of killing that the Buddha recommended against.
And so the rule was made that if you didn't kill the animal yourself, you didn't request it to be killed for you, and you are not aware that it was killed on your behalf, then karmically you are pure, because you were just wandering around through the villages collecting whatever people happen to want to put in your begging bowl. But in a situation where actually you are in charge of what you can eat, and you go into butcher shops and you buy meat, then in a way the very fact that you're buying it is saying that you are subscribing to the whole culture which rears meat to be killed for consumption. I mean, they only raise and kill these animals because people buy the meat. If we didn't buy it, that particular industry would die out.
That if somebody goes into a market, say on a Tuesday, and orders a piece of chicken, at the sales counter somebody will click some kind of calculator which will determine on Tuesday a piece of chicken was sold, which will send out a message for next Tuesday that we have to meet the same quantity of chickens to satisfy our customer base. You know, so even though when you order the chicken on Tuesday, you're not responsible for the death of the chicken that's providing that meal on Tuesday, but in an indirect way, you can be sending a signal that next Tuesday a chicken should be killed to provide food for the customers.
Many people who have not spent time with animals don't realize just how much like us they are. They're smart, sensitive, emotional, and it doesn't take long to realize that every animal has his own unique personality. However, despite their being sensitive, we often treat animals with extreme insensitivity, even cruelty.
Buddhists realize that all lives are equal in terms of wanting peace and happiness, not wanting pain and suffering. We are all same sentient being. Just we have a different form of life, but in terms of living the life is same, human or the animal, and same desire, same right to live in peace and happiness.
The Dharma relationship to animals, first and foremost, is the recognition that animals have consciousness, which means that they feel.
Animals is like ourselves. They also appreciate the kindness. They also fear of death and avoid sufferings, and also desire for happiness. I think we are human beings. We understand what is suffering and what is happiness, and also we are advanced enough to understand that the other animals also have that feeling as well.
You only have to live in a place like this where we see deer out the window and the mother deer with her little babies in the spring, and how tenderly she takes care of them and how much they look to their mother for safety and protection and follow her and feel safe with her, and to know that there's a bond there that's really precious for them. And in seeing that, it opens our hearts to that sense of connectedness. So I think just for people to broaden their understanding of animals and the animal experience is an important part of this consideration of choices in what we eat.
These animals are sentient beings that live, have their lives. And so I want to be able to treat the animal world with great respect, with great kindness, and that they have just as much right to be here as any other being.
For most of us, besides our companion animals, our main relationship to animals is the food we eat. Yet because the process of food production is hidden from sight, it's easy to avoid the connection between the food on our plates and the animal she once was. Are these animals being killed for you?
Normally people have no idea what animals go through. it will only be realized when you get to see what actually happens in the slaughterhouses. Until then, you wouldn't realize. And when you see that, actually, you will feel if that is really appropriate to eat them. It's really horrifying. Certain slaughterhouses have like the entire animal that they are supposed to slaughter for the day are standing in a corner out there, and then the one by another being slaughtered in front of the rest of the animal. And then you can imagine how terrifying that experience would be. Just imagine yourself being out there and all your friends and colleagues are being slaughtered and you are in the line, just a step away from that terrifying thing. According to most religion, talk about hell like most horrifying suffering realm, but I can't imagine there is something more horrifying and painful, so-called hell, than those horrifying experience when you are lined up in the slaughterhouse. Just heartbreaking. So we need to actually see those things so that how we humans are actually causing so much trouble to other fellow sentient beings.
It's said that throughout the average lifespan of an American who lives to be maybe 75, he or she will be responsible for the deaths of 15,000 animals, from large to small, on an average American diet. So that's a lot of killing, that's a lot of karma to be responsible for. There's not so much separation. There's an apparent separation between us and other creatures, but actually when we become very sensitive, we can feel that when we see another being in suffering, that we feel the suffering too. So usually this is a very human response. You cannot bear to see an animal killed in front of you or being, dying in front of you.
Well, just as I wouldn't particularly like someone to kill and eat me, I don't think any being wants to be slaughtered and killed and eaten. And especially considering the manner in which animals are killed in this day and age, the terror and trauma that they go through in the process. How can we sit down and eat them?
The Buddha really expressed his teaching, or reduced his teaching, in a very simple formula. He said, in the Pali, it's dukkha, dukkha, nirodha, it's 3 words. He said that he basically taught suffering, which means how it arises and all that, and the end of it, how we bring it to an end. Now, anybody in contact with suffering is moved by it. There's when we see somebody suffering or an animal suffering, there's a resonance in our own hearts which connects us with that suffering. We can call it a sorrow, and that sorrow drives us to try and do something about that person or that animal.
I don't think that by my eating vegetarian or my becoming vegetarian, being vegetarian or my other people becoming vegetarian, the world will stop killing. No matter how many people become vegetarians, the world will not stop killing. But we can minimize the amount of animals raised in farms for killing. The number of animals slaughtered can come down if people become vegetarians.
A lot of people pay attention to the precept about not taking a life, and that makes sense. That's kind of obvious. Almost every world religion has something about not killing, and there is no asterisk. It doesn't say humans. It says thou shalt not kill. Same with the Buddhist precepts. It doesn't say just humans. It says we shall not take breath away. We should not take a life. But the precept that gets very little attention, that I think is very important and related to that, is the precept of not taking that which is not freely offered. Because when we take cow's milk, that milk was created by the mother cow for her offspring. And when we take that milk away, we are taking that which is not freely offered. And when I say not freely offered, it's not freely offered for a number of reasons. There's a price the cow pays. The baby is taken away from the mother soon after birth, within days, so that we can take the milk. And I find that heartbreaking. And I've heard cows crying for one another. The mother cow is just belting and screaming for the baby, and the baby is crying for the mother, and it's heart-wrenching. We do that routinely so that humans can take the milk. To me, that is stealing. Also, we take the life of the cow in that after her production falls and she's not as productive as she was, that's another way we're taking her life, and we're taking that which is not freely given. It's not freely given because she gives her life for the milk industry. Even on the most humane farms, even where the cow is treated beautifully during life, she is repeatedly impregnated, repeatedly impregnated. It's a 9-month gestation, just like humans. She gives birth, and then the baby's taken away. And she has to be repeatedly impregnated so that she will keep milk flowing at the production levels that we've bred them to produce, and it's unnatural. So they're frequently uncomfortable. The udders are frequently distended and get mastitis and other problems. And we're stealing the milk from the baby whose milk it should be.
If you look at the life of a chicken raised for her eggs, they're all born in incubators. They don't have the benefit of their mother nurturing them. And then, of course, half of your little chicks are going to be males. And those male chickens that are raised for their eggs are not going to be good flesh producers. They're small animals that put all their nutrients into producing a large number of eggs. So the little male chicks are just ground up alive when they're less than a day old. And the females that are kept, then they have the tips of their beaks seared off. They're debeaked. And then they go live in a cage. And that's where they stay for 1.5 years, 2 years. And after that, their egg production decreases, and so they're gassed or they're sent to slaughter. So whether it's a free-range farm, a cage-free farm, or a battery farm, chickens have a horrendous life.
When everybody gets before King Yama after they've died and they start blaming each other. If you didn't want to eat it, I wouldn't kill it. And if you didn't kill it, I wouldn't sell it. And so we have the buyer, the seller, and the slaughterer all putting the blame on somebody else, when in fact, truly, it is interconnected. If you didn't have one, you wouldn't need the other. I see that argument as modern, but I also see it as ancient.
If you care about suffering, if you care about your own suffering and the suffering of others, then you want to know what that person, that other being's experience is. And you don't want to turn away, right? You want to know. You want to know how am I acting? What am I doing that I may not have been aware of that's creating difficulty and suffering? I think that would be true for anyone who cared about suffering. And you don't have to look very far or hard to see the suffering that comes, obviously, from killing animals. In the Dharma, part of what we're encouraged and invited to do is to turn towards suffering and not avert ourselves or turn away. We want to see what's the cause of my suffering and what leads to the end of suffering.
Of all the things we can do to help alleviate the suffering of animals, the most important is to stop eating them. You might also consider no longer consuming their products, such as milk and eggs. When you do, you may be surprised at just how good vegan food tastes. For those who find it difficult to stop all at once, a gradual transition may be easier. Maybe start by choosing one meal a day or one day a week to be vegetarian or vegan. Try substituting soy milk for cow's milk in your breakfast cereal.
It just takes 1 second to decide stopping. Now, it doesn't make any huge chaotic change in our life. It's just we eat something else. It's so simple. It can be done instantly. So less effort for the very big result, ethically, for the animals and the poor people, for the planet, for our own health. It seems a sensible mind should say this is not an extremist perspective, this is a most reasonable and compassionate point of view.
It's also about the environment that we need to protect. The environment not just about water and atmosphere, greenhouse, but it's also about forest, it's also about other form of life that we need to protect because it's an important ecosystem. So I think vegetarians is a very holistic approach that for us to embrace all that awareness and also the kindness and compassion practice are very much together in a very holistic way.
The point with vegetarianism is that in this modern day and age where food is so easily obtained, there doesn't seem to me to be too much excuse to eat any kind of food which has caused pain to another being. I mean, it doesn't seem to fit in with our whole idea on compassion and bodhicitta.
Previous to my monastic ordination, I was married and I had a child. I was once out with my son in his stroller. A lady came by and was admiring him and went for that typical pinch the chicks little movement and said something to the effect, "You're so cute I could eat you." And at that moment, it hit me like the proverbial ton of bricks that all the animals that are ever eaten are somebody's child. And I certainly didn't want my child eaten, even figuratively. So that was my transition from being a health-conscious vegetarian to an ethical vegetarian.
How can we bring this compassion to all beings? Yes, we may not be able to do it all the time. We may inadvertently be causing harm, but how, again, as I came back earlier, to cause the least harm possible and to become educated.